The knife came at Jack Corrigan's throat so fast he barely saw it move. He threw himself backward, boots sliding in the Arizona dust, and felt the blade whisper past his jaw close enough to taste steel. The masked Apache warrior didn't pause, didn't reset or calculate like other fighters Jack had faced. The warrior simply flowed forward like water finding a crack, already committed to the next strike before Jack could catch his breath. Jack was a big man, weathered by 38 years of frontier life, with hands that could break horseshoes and a reputation for never backing down. None of it mattered now. He swung his own blade in a desperate arc, putting his weight behind it, but the warrior slipped aside with impossible grace. It was like fighting smoke, like trying to grab hold of wind. Every move Jack made felt too slow, too heavy, too obvious against this opponent who seemed to anticipate his intentions before he'd even formed them. Around them, the skirmish raged, gunfire cracking, men shouting, dust churning into clouds that turned the afternoon's sun blood red. Jack's cavalry unit had been ambushed in the rocky borderlands, caught between stone outcrops that turned every shadow into potential death. But all that faded into background noise. Right now, his entire world had shrunk to this single opponent, this warrior who moved like nothing he'd ever seen in 15 years of frontier fighting. Jack had fought Apaches before. He knew their strength, their endurance, their tactical brilliance. But this was different. This warrior didn't fight with raw power or tactical patience. Every movement was surgical precision wrapped in liquid speed, strikes that came from angles that shouldn't exist, footwork that seemed to defy balance and gravity. The leather mask covering the warrior's face gave nothing away, just dark eyes watching him with cold, complete focus that never wavered even as they circled each other in the dust. Jack's lungs burned. His arms felt like lead. He'd been fighting for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, and he was losing ground with every exchange. The warrior's stamina seemed endless, inhuman. Jack stumbled over loose rock, caught himself, but it cost him a fraction of a second. The warrior was already inside his guard, blade rising toward his ribs in a strike that would end this. Jack threw up his arm in pure reflex. Their wrist collided hard enough to send pain shooting to his shoulder. They crashed together, grappling now, too close for blades. Jack used his size, his weight, driving forward to break the warrior's balance. They went down together in a tangle of limbs and dust, rolling, struggling for dominance as Jack's survival instincts overrode everything else. His hand caught the edge of the leather mask during the struggle. It was an accident, his fingers seeking purchase, finding the worn leather strap instead. He yanked without thinking, desperate for any advantage, and felt the strap tear under the pressure. The mask came away in his hand, and for a heartbeat Jack found himself staring down at the face beneath, his mind unable to process what his eyes were telling him. A woman. The warrior was a woman. But that wasn't what paralyzed him, wasn't what turned his blood to ice and his thoughts to white noise. It was her eyes, dark brown, wide with the same shock that must be written across his own face. It was the line of her jaw, the shape of her mouth, features that reached across 5 years of grief and loss and grabbed him by the throat with impossible recognition. It couldn't be. She was dead. He'd searched through the burning wagons, through the bodies, through the smoke and screaming until his throat was raw. She was dead. He'd mourned her. He'd carried that guilt like a stone in his chest for 5 long years. But she was staring up at him now, alive, real, breathing hard from exertion, her blade still pressed against his side but utterly motionless. Around them, the fighting continued. Distant shouts, the crack of rifles, men dying in the dust of this godforsaken territory. But Jack and the woman existed in a bubble of impossible silence, locked together on the ground, both frozen by recognition that neither could explain and neither could deny, while the world raged on without them. 5 years earlier, Jack Corrigan had been a different man. Younger, certainly, 33 and still believing the frontier could be tamed without losing your soul in the process. He'd signed on as a cavalry scout for a settler wagon train pushing west through Apache territory, more out of wanderlust than conviction, and had expected nothing more than another few weeks of dust and boredom punctuated by moments of terror. What he hadn't expected was Elena Montoya. She was a daughter of a merchant family from Santa Fe, traveling with her father and uncle to start a trading post near the new settlements. Dark hair that caught the sunset like black silk, eyes that seemed to hold both fire and thoughtfulness in equal measure. But it wasn't her beauty that caught Jack's attention during those long days on the trail. It was a way she moved between worlds without fear. Elena spoke Apache, had been partially raised by a peaceful Apache woman named Keita who'd worked for her family since Elena was a girl. While other settlers whispered nervously about every shadow and rock formation, Elena talked about the land with respect, even love, teaching Jack phrases in a language he'd only ever heard shouted in battle. They fell into an easy rhythm during the journey. Jack would ride ahead to scout, then circle back to find Elena walking beside her family's wagon. And somehow his horse always needed to slow right there. They shared watch duties when the train circled for the night. Under stars that seemed close enough to touch, Elena would tell him about Keitua's teachings, how the Apache saw the land as alive, as family, how the endless wave of settlers wasn't just an inconvenience but an existential threat to everything they knew. Jack had never thought about it that way before. He'd seen Apaches as obstacles, problems to be solved or avoided. Elena showed him people. The connection between them grew like a slow fire, unspoken but undeniable. Stolen glances across the campfire, her hand brushing his when she passed him coffee. The way she'd laugh at his terrible jokes, genuine and warm. Jack had started imagining a future, maybe a ranch, maybe a life where he didn't have to kill or be killed, where Elena's dream of understanding might actually mean something. He'd never told her any of this. There'd been time, he'd thought. They had weeks of trail left, and then maybe he'd find the courage. Then came a dawn raid. Jack had been on the far side of the circled wagons when the first shots cracked through the morning stillness. Apache warriors came pouring out of the hills like a flood, not random violence but calculated fury, warriors defending their hunting grounds from yet another intrusion. The settlers had unknowingly camped on sacred ground, and desperation made men do terrible things on both sides. Wagons erupted in flames. People scattered, screaming. Jack fought his way toward Elena's wagon through smoke and chaos, his heart hammering with pure terror. He'd been too late. Elena's wagon was overturned, burning. Her father lay dead in the dirt, an arrow through his chest. Jack searched frantically through the carnage, calling her name until his throat was raw, choking on smoke and gunpowder. He'd found her torn dress cord on a wagon wheel, soaked in blood. He'd searched for hours after the raiders withdrew, turning over bodies, praying not to find her and desperate to find her all at once. But Elena Montoya had simply vanished into the smoke, and Jack had spent 5 years certain she'd died screaming, certain he'd failed the one person who'd made him believe in something better. Now, lying in the Arizona dust with a blade pressed to his ribs, Jack stared into eyes that shouldn't exist. The bone structure was right. The way she held herself, even in combat, carried that same fierce grace. His mind fought against the impossible mathematics of it. Elena died 5 years ago. He'd mourned her. He'd buried that hope along with his youngest self's naive dreams. But what if she hadn't died? What if the smoke and chaos had hidden something else entirely? Something his grief-shattered mind had been unable to imagine. Jack's voice came out as barely more than a whisper, cracked and disbelieving. Elena. The woman's eyes widened, but not with joy or relief, with conflict, with something that looked almost like pain. She responded in rapid Apache, the words sharp and angry, but Jack caught the tremor underneath, the hairline fracture in her composure. Around them, the sounds of battle were changing. The gunfire had grown sporadic. Men were shouting orders to withdraw on both sides, the skirmish burning itself out as quickly as it had ignited. She should kill him now while she had the chance, or flee back to her people before anyone noticed her absence. Instead, she did neither. Her hand shot out and grabbed Jack's arm with surprising strength. She hauled him to his feet and pulled him away from the open ground, moving fast and low toward a cluster of rocky outcrops 30 yards distant. Jack stumbled after her, too stunned to resist, his mind still trying to process what his eyes were telling him. She dragged him behind the rocks where the stone formed a natural shelter, hidden from both the retreating cavalry and the Apache warriors gathering their wounded. Only then did she release him, stepping back with her knife still in hand, her breathing hard and her eyes never leaving his face. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Jack opened his mouth twice before any words would come. "You alive? How are you alive?" She stared at him, and he watched her jaw work as if the English words were buried deep and had to be excavated one by one. When she finally spoke, her voice carried an accent he didn't remember, the syllables shaped by 5 years of speaking a different tongue. "I was Elena Montoya. That girl is dead." "Dead? You're standing right in front of me. You don't understand." She switched back to Apache for a moment, frustrated, then forced herself back to English. "The raid. I was taken. Not killed. Bleeding. Afraid. Everything gone. But not by the warriors who attacked the wagons." Jack's mind raced, trying to fill in the gaps, trying to make sense of what she was telling him. "Then who?" "An Apache woman named Nolan found me in the smoke, half dead, separated from everyone. She had lost her daughter 2 seasons before to white man sickness. She saw me and saw a second chance. Maybe. She hid me from the warriors who would have killed me. She nursed me, kept me alive when I wanted to die." The word came faster now, as if a dam had broken. "At first, I waited. I thought you would come. I thought someone would come. I tried to remember prayers in Spanish, in English. I counted days by scratching marks in the dirt inside Nolan's dwelling. I searched for you," Jack said, and the words came out raw. "I looked through every body, every burned wagon. I found your dress, Elena. There was so much blood. My name is Dahana now." She said it firmly, like she was trying to convince herself as much as him. "It means warrior woman. I earned that name. No one gave it to me out of pity." Jack felt something breaking inside his chest. "Why didn't you try to come back? Why didn't you run? There must have been chances." "Back to what?" She cut him off, and now there was heat in her voice, anger that had been building for 5 years. "Back to a world that was pushing west, taking everything, killing everyone who stood in the way. Nolan became my mother. She taught me the language, the ways. The tribe didn't trust me at first. I was the enemy, the invader's daughter. But slowly, I learned. I learned why they fought. Stolen land, Jack. Broken treaties. Children murdered, elders driven from their homes. The savage raiders you fought were fathers protecting their families, the same as my father tried to protect me before he died." "I know that," Jack said quietly. "I know that now. But you can't tell me you chose this. You were taken, Elena. I was given a choice." The words exploded out of her. "Stay and learn and become part of something, or try to return to a world where I'd be pitted at best, property at worst. Another pretty thing for some man to own, to keep in a house while he made decisions about my life. Hey, I'm not decoration. I'm a warrior. I hunt. I fight. I have a voice in council. I'm free, Jack. More free than I ever was in your world." The truth of it hit Jack like a physical blow. He'd spent 5 years mourning a memory, a young woman who'd existed in his imagination as someone who needed saving. But the person standing in front of him now had saved herself, had chosen a path he couldn't even comprehend. His romantic fantasy crashed against her lived reality, and the cognitive dissonance was almost unbearable. A shout echoed from somewhere beyond the rocks. Apache word calling for Dahana, voices edged with suspicion. She stiffened, glancing back toward the sound. When she looked at Jack again, there was pain in her eyes, but also certainty, the kind of certainty that comes from years of hard choices. "The Elena you knew died in that fire," she said quietly. "I'm sorry. I'm sorry you searched. I'm sorry you grieved. But that girl doesn't exist anymore." She turned to leave, to slip back through the rocks to her people, to the life she'd built from ashes and blood. Jack stood frozen, his hand half raised, caught between letting her disappear again and calling out to stop her, knowing that either choice would tear something irreparable inside him. Jack didn't call out. He stood there in the shadows of the rocks, hands still half raised, and watched her slip away through the stone corridors back toward her people. The smart thing would have been to rejoin his own unit, to report what he'd seen, to let the cavalry officers make sense of it. Instead, Jack Corrigan made a decision that would have gotten him court-martialed or killed. He deserted his post and followed her. Over the next 3 days, he tracked the Apache band's movements through the high country, staying far enough back to avoid detection, but close enough to keep them in sight. He wasn't fighting anymore, wasn't even thinking like a soldier. He was observing, trying to understand what Elena had seen that transformed her into Dahana. He'd been taught to see Apaches as obstacles, as savages to be removed or subdued. Now, hidden in the hills above their camp, he watched families. Children played games in the dust, their laughter carrying on the wind. Elders sat in the shade and worked leather with patient hands, teaching younger members skills passed down through generations. Women gathered plants he couldn't name, talking and working together with the ease of long companionship. Warriors trained with weapons and horses, but they also told stories, laughed, tended to each other's injuries with care. Jack watched Dahana move through this world and saw how completely she belonged. They greeted her with respect. She sat in councils where her voice carried weight. When she practiced combat, younger warriors watched to learn. She wasn't pretending or surviving. She was home. The observation should have been boring, should have confirmed what he already believed or dismissed what Elena had told him. Instead, it cracked something open inside Jack's chest. He remembered conversations under stars 5 years ago, Elena talking about understanding instead of fighting, about seeing people instead of enemies. He thought it was naive then, the idealism of someone who hadn't seen real violence. Now, hiding in the rocks with a rifle he had no intention of using, he was forced to confront the truth she'd tried to show him. These were people defending their homes, their families, their way of life against an invasion they'd never asked for. Down in the camp, Dahana sat with an older Apache woman near a fire, their heads bent close in conversation. Jack couldn't hear the words, but he recognized the posture. Confession, maybe, or seeking counsel. He didn't know that Dahana was telling Nolan about the man from her before life, about eyes that had once looked at her with hope and now looked at her with confusion and grief. Nolan listened the way she always did, patient and wise, before speaking in their shared language. He was part of your before life, daughter, but you cannot live in 2 rivers at once. You must choose which current to follow. I have chosen, Dahana said, but even as she spoke, her eyes drifted toward the hills where she sensed a presence watching. She'd spotted signs of Jack's tracking 2 days ago, broken branches, disturbed stones, the kind of mistakes a cavalry scout wouldn't normally make unless some part of him wanted to be found. On the 4th day, Jack's luck ran out. A young Apache scout named Goethle, sharp-eyed and cautious, spotted movement in the rocks above the camp. He'd been about to raise the alarm when Dahana appeared at his side, her hand on his arm, her voice urgent and low. Jack, watching from his hiding place, saw the exchange but couldn't hear it. He saw the young scout's skeptical expression, saw Dahana speaking rapidly, gesturing, making some kind of case. Then she was leading the scout toward the council area where the elders gathered, and Jack knew his time had run out. When the warriors came for him an hour later, Jack didn't resist. They surrounded him with weapons drawn, their faces hard with suspicion and barely contained fury. A white man spying on their camp deserved death, and they all knew it. But Dahana stood before the tribal council and spoke words Jack couldn't understand, her voice steady despite what he recognized as a lie forming on her lips. She gestured to him, to herself, touched her ribs where his blade had come close during their fight, claiming he'd saved her life, maybe, vouching for him when every logical reason said she shouldn't. The elders debated in Apache while Jack stood under guard, understanding nothing except that his life hung on Dahana's words. Finally, the eldest among them, a man with silver hair and eyes that had seen too many seasons of war, spoke. The decision came through Dahana's translation, temporary sanctuary, but under her responsibility. If Jack betrayed them, both of their lives would be forfeit. She'd gambled everything on a man she'd known 5 years ago, on memories that might not mean anything anymore. They brought Jack into the camp as a watched guest, gave him water and basic provisions, but kept him under constant guard. Dahana was assigned to watch him, forced proximity that made them both uncomfortable. For the first day, they barely spoke. The wounds were too fresh, the divide too vast. She showed him where he could sleep, where he could relieve himself, the boundaries he couldn't cross. He nodded and obeyed, aware that dozens of eyes tracked his every movement with mistrust. But necessity breeds conversation the way drought breeds fire. On the second day, as she walked him through the camp to fetch water, Jack asked questions and Dahana answered them, slowly at first, then with more openness. She explained the meaning of the symbols painted on certain dwellings, the hierarchy of the council, the rituals that govern daily life. She made him see not savage customs but human systems, different from his own but no less valid. In return, Jack shared news from the outside world, settlements pushing west, the cavalry's growing presence, territories shrinking year by year. The information was strategic, possibly dangerous, but also honest. They were both trapped now, him physically, her emotionally, and honesty seemed like the only currency worth anything. On the third evening, as the sun painted the sky in shades of copper and blood, Jack sat near the fire Dahana tended and asked the question that had been building in him since that faced impossible moment of recognition. Do you ever miss it? Your old life? Dahana was quiet for a long time, staring into the flames. When she finally answered, her voice was soft but certain. Every day. But missing something doesn't mean it was right for me. The warning came at dawn. A young scout rode into camp hard, his horse lathered and breathing like a bellows, shouting before he'd even dismounted. Jack didn't need to understand Apache to recognize the panic in the man's voice or the way every warrior in camp immediately reached for weapons. Dahana's face went pale as she listened to the scout's report. Then she turned to Jack with eyes that held both accusation and desperate calculation. Cavalry patrol, she said, the English words clipped and urgent. Your people. They are tracking the warriors from the skirmish, and they are less than a day behind us. The captain leading them is known for burning camps and taking no prisoners. Jack's stomach dropped. Captain Hendricks, a man who saw Apaches as vermin to be exterminated, who'd once bragged about killing women because they'd grow up to be warriors' mothers. If Hendricks found this camp, there wouldn't be a negotiation or surrender. There would only be massacre. The tribal council convened immediately, voices rising in heated debate that Jack could only partially follow through Dahana's toast translations. Some warriors wanted to fight, to set an ambush and bleed the cavalry before they could reach the camp. Others argued for scattering, splitting into small groups and regrouping later in the high country. But there were injured warriors who couldn't travel fast, elders who'd never survive a forced march through hostile territory, children too young to move quietly through dangerous ground. Every option carried death. Dahana stood and spoke, her voice cutting through the argument. Jack watched the elders' faces shift from attention to shock to outrage as she laid out her proposal. She was pointing at him, making some kind of case, and he understood before she translated what she was suggesting. Let him go back. Let him mislead the patrol. Buy them time to move the vulnerable to safety. Several warriors shouted her down immediately. One man lunged to his feet, gesturing violently at Jack, clearly arguing that trusting a white soldier was suicide. But Dahana held her ground, speaking with conviction about what Jack had witnessed over the past days, how he'd watched, and learned instead of condemning. Nolan rose to support her adopted daughter, her weathered face calm, but her words carrying weight that made the angry voices quiet. The eldest council member studied Jack with eyes that seemed to look straight through flesh to whatever truth lay beneath. The decision came with a condition. Dahana would accompany Jack to ensure compliance. If he betrayed them, she would kill him herself before the cavalry could use her. It was a death sentence either way if things went wrong, for both of them. Dahana accepted without hesitation. They rode out within the hour, 2 horses moving fast through terrain that shifted from rocky hills to scrub desert. For the first few miles, they didn't speak. The weight of what they were attempting pressed down like physical force. Finally, as they paused to water the horses at a thin creek, Jack broke the silence. I'm sorry, he said, and the words came out raw. 5 years ago, I should have found you. I should have looked harder, fought harder. I've been carrying that guilt like a stone, and seeing you alive just made it heavier because now I know I failed someone who actually survived. Dahana was quiet for a moment, then spoke without looking at him. I waited for you at first. Every day, I'd listen for sounds of a rescue party, for someone coming. Part of me hated Nolan for hiding me, hated myself for not trying harder to escape. When I finally accepted that no one was coming, I hated myself even more for adapting, for learning to love the people whose warriors had killed my father. The guilt nearly destroyed me, feeling like I was betraying my blood family by becoming part of the tribe that fought against everything they represented. "You didn't betray anyone," Jack said. "You survived. So did you. But we both turned that survival into a weapon against ourselves." She finally looked at him, and in her eyes Jack saw the mirror of his own fractured soul. They were both caught between worlds, both carrying impossible choices, both changed by violence and loss into something neither of them fully recognized. As the sun climbed higher, they spotted dust on the horizon, the cavalry patrol. Jack's former unit, men he'd fought beside, led by a captain who'd see Dahana as a trophy or threat. This was a moment. Dahana reined in her horse and turned to face him fully. "You don't owe us this," she said quietly. "You can go back to your life, tell them you escaped, that you saw nothing. No one would question it." Jack looked at the dust cloud, then back at Dahana, and felt something fundamental shift inside his chest. The man he'd been, the soldier who followed orders, who saw the world in simple divisions of us and them, was dying, and something else was being born in the space that grief and recognition had carved out. "My life is wherever truth is," he said. "I've been fighting for the wrong reasons, killing for causes I didn't question because questioning felt like weakness. Maybe I can't fix the past or bring back the people we've lost, but I can try to do one right thing, just once, and live with whatever comes after." Jack found Captain Hendrick's patrol at midday, riding in alone with his hands visible and his story already formed in his mind. He'd been taken prisoner during the skirmish, he told them, held for days before managing to escape. The Apache band had moved north into the canyon country, he said, pointing toward terrain so rugged it would take the cavalry a week to search properly. Hendricks believed him because men like Hendricks always believed their own superiority made them impossible to deceive. The patrol rode north while Jack watched them go, knowing he'd just severed every tie to the life he'd known. 3 days later, he returned to the prearranged meeting spot, a cluster of cottonwoods near Seasonal Stream. Dahana was waiting with supplies and a horse, her face unreadable in the late afternoon light. She told him the tribe had relocated safely, that the elders were grateful, that sanctuary was his if he wanted it. But she also told him he was free to ride away, to start over somewhere the war hadn't reached yet, to leave this chapter behind and become someone new. Jack looked at the horse, at the supplies, at the woman who'd once been Elena Montoya and was now something more complicated than any single name could hold. He thought about riding west to California, or south into Mexico, disappearing into some place where nobody knew what he'd been or what he'd done. It would be easier. It would be simpler. "I can't go back," he said finally. "But I'm not sure I can fully go forward either. Not into a world I'm still learning to understand. What if I stayed nearby? Not in the tribe, but not gone either. Somewhere in between." Dahana's expression shifted, something like relief crossing her face. Living on the boundary, helping where you can, learning where you must, existing in the space between worlds. She understood it immediately because she'd been living it for 5 years, caught between Elena and Dahana, between two peoples at war. It's the only honest choice for someone who's seen both sides. They weren't lovers, not in any traditional sense. There was no passionate reunion, no promise of a future together. The romance between them was quieter, more complex. Two souls recognizing each other across an unbridgeable divide and choosing connection anyway, even knowing it meant living in perpetual liminality. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, they rode to a ridge that overlooked both the distant Apache camp and the far-off settlement spreading across the land like a slow stain. Dahana told him the name the tribe had given him, Nalnish, which meant one who works across or one who acts between. Jack repeated it slowly, feeling the shape of it in his mouth, understanding that he was no longer cowboy or cavalry scout or any of the simple identities he'd worn before. He'd become something else, something the world didn't have a proper word for yet. "You're still Dahana," he said. "I'm Dahana. I'm also Elena. I've stopped trying to kill one to let the other live." She looked at him with eyes that held both versions of herself, integrated now, complex and complete. The world wants us to choose sides, to be one thing or another. But some of us are made of contradictions, and that's not weakness. It's just truth. They sat there as the light turned gold and then amber, two figures on a ridge between worlds. In a time of sharp divides and violent certainties, they'd chosen the hardest path, to stand in the space between, to refuse simple loyalties when both sides had forgotten their shared humanity. It wasn't a triumphant ending. It wasn't tragic either. It was honest and bittersweet and profoundly human. Two people who'd lost everything finding something like belonging in the act of refusing to belong anywhere completely. The war would continue. The settlements would keep spreading, and the Apache would keep fighting for land that was being stolen season by season. But hey, on this ridge, for this moment, there was only truth and the quiet courage it took to live it.